me know. Otherwise, we're going to start looking at just the anatomy of the respiratory system. We'll save the physiology for next week after you've gotten through this cardiovascular exam, because the physiology gets a little complicated and I don't want to confuse you right before an exam on something different. So our respiratory system, of course, exchanges oxygen and disposes of carbon dioxide. We use oxygen for cellular respiration. Oh, we use oxygen to generate energy or ATP in our system. We also need to get rid of any of the wastes, such as carbon dioxide, and we do that all through our lungs. So we're following the respiratory or the cardiovascular system with the respiratory system because they work so closely together. But our respiratory system also is what lets us smell. Olfaction is smell. It's also what produces our voice, our speech. So we're going to look at the anatomy of all that tonight. First, let's look at what is respiration. In the respiratory system, we have what is called respiratory ventilation. That's just our breathing air in and out. Well, external respiration is what's being exchanged between the blood and the lungs. We exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. We want to get rid of the bad and get the good stuff into our system that we can use. Respiration in the circulatory system involves transport, because our red blood cells transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we, along with having external respiration, we also have internal respiration. Our lungs and blood vessels exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen throughout our entire system, our entire body, I should say, because our body is a bunch of systems. We are exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide with tissues within the blood. That's happening all throughout the body. So we have both
Good boy, Bo.
internal and external respiration. So here is our respiratory system, and it shows those four processes of respiration. At the top part up here, we have the pulmonary ventilation, which is us breathing in and out air. We have our external respiration, which is where oxygen goes into the blood, carbon dioxide goes into the lungs so we can breathe it out. Our transport system. Our whole circulatory system is a transport system that takes oxygen where it needs to go and picks up carbon dioxide along the way. And then our internal respiration is where we're exchanging oxygen from carbon dioxide at the cellular level. So this is all what's taking place in our systems all day, every day. So the parts to the respiratory system. We have an upper and a lower respiratory system. Our upper respiratory system is our nose, nasal cavity, our paranasal sinuses, our pharynx. The lower respiratory system includes the larynx, the trachea, bronchi, and their branches, the lungs, and the alveoli. We're going to look at all of this tonight and look at it in detail. So this picture kind of shows all of the parts of the respiratory system, because it also includes that diaphragm, which we need for breathing. I included these charts out of your textbook that talks about the different structures, what they do, their general features of each. We're going to kind of look into all of these. So let's start with the upper respiratory system. Our upper respiratory system has our nose and our paranasal sinuses. The only external part to our respiratory system is that nose. That's the part where we breathe air in. Technically, the back of our throat, our mouth in a way does, but our nose is meant specifically for breathing. So our nose, it provides that airway for breathing. When air is breathed into your nose, it goes through, there's those hairs just inside your nose. It filters and cleans the air, tries to get rid of any kind of microbes or particles that are in the air. Then as the air gets up into the nasal cavity, it gets moistened and warmed before it goes down into the lungs. Your nose is also considered a resonating chamber for speech. But we also have our olfactory receptors. So we have nerves that go into our nose that lets us smell things. So we have an external nose and a nasal cavity. The parts of the nose, we have the bridge of the nose, or the root, bridge and root. The dorsum of your nose is right at the top towards the center. The ala are kind of your nostrils, but they're like the top part. They get right the top above your nostrils. We have the apex, just the tip of your nose. And the nares, that is technically the nostrils, because your nostrils are considered the openings in your nose. So here's a kind of drawing that shows how we have our two nasal bones that make up the only bone that's part of your nose. The rest of it is cartilage. And there's also a little bit of connective tissue in there. But this is, you can see that septal cartilage, we have lateral pieces to it. We have the middle part of that septal cartilage. We have the major alar cartilages. And then we have along the sides that dense fibrous connective tissue. So if you notice with your nose, it's not that part that makes up the lateral part of your nose, right above that, those nostrils, that isn't as hard as, say, the center of your nose, right at that apex. That's a lot stiffer than the outside. So you can kind of see where the connective tissue is versus cartilage in your nose. So our nasal cavity, that is found within and posterior to the external nose. So if you remember from Anatomy 1, Bones chapter, we have a nasal septum that is made up. In the front, it's septal cartilage, but in the back, we have our vomer bone and that perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. That is what separates your nasal cavity into right and left sides, is that bone going all the way back. We have posterior nasal apertures, or concha. And this is where the air is kind of circulated through to help warm and moisten that air before it gets breathed into your lungs. The roof of your nasal cavity is made up of the ethmoid and the sphenical bones. And the floor is the hard palate, which is made up of that palatine bone and that maxillary bone. And then we also have soft palate muscles that make up part of that floor as well. A nasal vestibule is the area just above those nostrils. That's the area that is lined with those hairs or vestibrias. And that's what helps filter the air. Helps to keep us from breathing in any kind of pathogens or foreign invaders that could hurt us or make us sick or something. We have the olfactory mucosa. That's at the top portion, and it has that olfactory epithelium. That's what kind of helps us smell things. And then we have that respiratory mucosa, which is
Excuse me?
yes.
I have a question. Okay,
Okay.
so for the heart exam, when is that due? Because I know we took the lab. Is it due tomorrow or next week?
It's due Monday by midnight.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Well, that respiratory mucosa is made up of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Remember anything from Anatomy 1, what that looks like. So those tall columnar cells, but they're not all going to reach up to the top, but they all touch that basement membrane. That's what makes them pseudostratified, and they're ciliated, so they have hair on them. And those little finger-like protections. They also have these goblet cells in here. These goblet cells are what secrete some kind of mucus that helps to kind of help catch anything that the nasal cavity did not catch as you were breathing in air. But it also, so then it helps to move things back up towards the throat. So within that nasal cavity, we have different glands because that's what creates the mucus in our nasal cavity, because that also helps to try to collect and catch different foreign particles. That mucus that gets secreted also contains different enzymes. Those enzymes can be used to help kill different foreign invaders. They have lysosome in there and defensins. Those help to get rid of any foreign invaders that may have come into the body. And as I just drew those ciliated cells up here, these help to push mucus towards the throat. So as this mucus gets secreted, it's helping to push it towards the throat so you can pretty much swallow it down. So we have a lot of blood supply, just like anywhere else in the body. We have a lot of blood supply in our nasal area. And as air gets circulated through those nasal concha, when you're breathing in, those lots of blood supply in there, they're providing the warmth that's helping to warm that air specifically. And we have, along with a lot of blood vessels, we're always going to have a lot of nerves. So I have something, you breathe in something and kind of tickles feel like you have that tickle in your nose. That's what can cause you to sneeze, cause you to get rid of whatever's tickling your nose and get it out of your body as fast as it possibly can. So if you remember looking at the skull at all from Anatomy 1, we have these nasal concha. They are these kind of those projections. They kind of come out medially from that lateral wall. So if this is my nasal septum, I have these on this side, and this side I have these little nasal concha. Except for there should be 3 in there. There. Those work as little turbines to get the air moving. It increases the air's rate of motion. There's that superior, middle, and inferior. They, as I've said, they help to filter, heat, and moisten the air that you breathe in, but it also prevents the loss of too much moisture and heat when you breathe out. We don't need to be losing a lot of air, or like not air, losing a lot of heat and moisture through breathing. We lose enough moisture through our skin every day. We don't need to lose enough more moisture from just breathing. We have different sinuses. I'm sure you looked at the different sinuses when you looked at bones in the skull in Anatomy 1, but we have a frontal sinus, a sphenoid sinus, an ethmoid sinus, and a maxillary sinus. These all help, again, to lighten that skull, because putting these holes or these air pockets into the skull, it helps to make your head so it's not so heavy. All of these sinuses secrete mucus, just help warm and moisten the air, just like your nasal concha. So here is a side view from inside the nose. We have our frontal sinus, our sphenoidal sinus. You can see the nostrils and the nasal vestibule. Here is that superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. These are what helps to moisten air going down, but prevents the loss of moisture when you're breathing out. And this whole thing is in the back, creates that posterior nasal aperture. And then as we talked about at the top, we have that olfactory epithelium. You see all these little holes here in that ethmoid bone. This is where the olfactory nerve comes out. It comes down here and puts little projections into the nasal area, that nasal cavity, and detects smells. And then it sends that information to your brain to tell you what it is. So here's the same thing on a cadaver. You can see the hairs from the nasal vestibule, how that hard palate makes the bottom. You can even see those olfactory nerves peeking through that cribriform plate. Those nasal meatises or concha. The meatus is the area below it. Between the two is the meatus. The concha is the actual bony curved part. The rhinitis. and we see itis, itis is going to mean an inflammation. So rhinitis, we have inflammation of that nasal mucosa. And that's that nasal mucosa, it continues all the way down the back of your throat into your trachea. So it's continuous with that respiratory tract. So if you get some kind of infection in your nasal cavity, it can spread really quickly from that nose to the throat and even into the chest. It can spread to tear ducts. So in your eye, that lacrimal duct that collects the tears, that could even get infected. Paranasal sinuses. This is what causes blockage of those sinus pathways. So if you feel like you're congested, can't breathe out of your nose as well, it very well could be rhinitis that is causing sinusitis or sinusitis when your sinuses start to get inflamed. So it starts usually as rhinitis, and then as it kind of travels places, it can get into your sinuses and infect in there as well. And when you get sinusitis, the absorption of air kind of produces this vacuum that gives you a really nice sinus headache. That's what gives you that sinus headache. It's like this vacuum suction type feeling. So that's our whole nasal cavity. Now, as we move back behind the nasal cavity, we get the pharynx. The pharynx is made of smooth muscle, and it runs from the base of the skull to the C6 vertebrae. This whole area is what connects your nose and mouth to the larynx, which is the next one down. We have pharynx, then larynx, and then it connects the esophagus. We have skeletal muscle back there, a lot of skeletal muscle back there. We also have smooth muscle back around in there. So we have the nasal pharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So you can kind of guess where those are located. Nasopharynx is the posterior part of that, behind that nasal cavity. Oropharynx, mouth, oral, mouth. So it has to be part of that posterior mouth. And then the laryngopharynx is below that. So let's look at the nasopharynx. That nasopharynx, of course, it's in the posterior nasal cavity, as I just pointed out. This is where we start seeing that pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The job of that soft palate, which is at the posterior portion of the hard palate, and that uvula, if you ever wondered what that is for, that's supposed to close off that nasopharynx when you're swallowing something to try to prevent backflow up into your nose. I mean, it happens. Trying to laugh and drink at the same time. It usually happens then. But that soft palate and that uvula are supposed to close off that whole nasal cavity off, so you can swallow and things go the correct direction. In the nasopharynx, we have what are called pharyngeal tonsils or adenoids. These are on the back wall of that nasopharynx. We have pharyngeotympanic tubes or your auditory tubes. That's what's supposed to help with the equalize the pressure in your ears. So, because if you remember from Anatomy 1, you have that exterior auditory canal, then you have that middle ear, and then you have that inner ear. That middle ear will drain, or it's supposed to drain, any extra fluids and kind of keep your equilibrium in that middle ear. Our oropharynx. Oro is mouth, so that's our passageway for food. We also can get air from the level of the soft palate. So if you're breathing through your mouth, we get air that way too. We have stratified squamous epithelium in our oropharynx because as we're chewing different foods, we're getting a lot of different, like those tissues go through a lot of possible damage just depending on what you're eating. So stratified squamous epithelium sloughs off cells easily. It replaces cells super easily. It helps to keep everything in your mouth secure. We have the isthmus of Fauces. That is what they call the opening to the oral cavity. We have palatine tonsils and lingual tonsils. Palatine tonsils are kind of on that lateral wall, while lingual tonsils are on the back surface of the tongue. I have pictures of these. The laryngopharynx. So that's where our air and our food go. We have our epiglottis back there. Our epiglottis, what opens and closes to let air versus food and water go through. The laryngopharynx will become continuous with that esophagus that goes down to the stomach. And just like the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx is also lined with stratified squamous epithelium. So here we can kind of see, we see where that soft palate is. This whole soft palate back here is what'll close when you're trying to swallow something. On the back part, this is on the back wall, that oropharynx. You see those palatine tonsils? Lingual tonsils are on the back of the tongue here, on that posterior wall. Up in that nasopharynx, you see these pharyngeal tonsils up in this top corner. These are all the different tonsils that we find throughout our oral and nasal cavity. You can see the epiglottis. We've talked about that a little bit. This is what opens and closes for breathing versus swallowing. You kind of see how big and how muscular your tongue is. It does a lot of work. So it needs a lot of muscles in there. So if your adenoids or tonsils get swollen and infected, they can actually start to block that nasopharynx, which is why you'd have to start breathing through your mouth. Because if those tonsils up here like these palatine tonsils or these lingual tonsils swell up enough, they're going to completely block off that area. You're not going to be able to get air through. So your air doesn't really get moistened before it goes to the lungs. Doesn't get warmed either, especially on cold mornings like we've been having. So if they're constantly enlarged, you may not be able to sleep well. You may not be able to speak well. The whole area plays a role in how you talk, how you sleep, being able to sleep. They all play a big important role. So your lower respiratory system, we have our larynx, our trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So they break it down into two areas. We think of our respiratory zone as where gas exchange happens. This is where we're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. And the respiratory zone consists of, we have respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. We'll look at all of those. We have conducting zones. These conducting zones help kind of transport carbon dioxide where it needs to go so it can be exchanged with or oxygen where it needs to go to be exchanged with the blood. It takes carbon dioxide back out so it can be breathed back out. That includes all of our respiratory structures. So all the way up into our nose, our nasal concha, our nares, all of that is involved. Because that's what cleanses, warms, and humidifies the air that you breathe into your nose every day, every second. So our larynx, our voice box is known as the larynx. And that is from the 3rd to the 6th cervical vertebrae. It also attaches to that hyoid bone. I don't remember if I said it to you guys or if I said it to somebody else, but that hyoid bone actually plays a role in the sound of your voice. So that larynx, of course, it's going to provide that airway. It's a route for air and food. That's what produces your voice. So it has your vocal cords in there. Your larynx has hyaline cartilage. That hyaline cartilage and helps to protect the area. We also have that thyroid cartilage. And that is, in men, you can see really well that Adam's apple and their neck, that is their thyroid cartilage. Theirs is usually more prominent than in females. But we also have cricoid cartilage, arytenoid cartilages, cuneiform cartilage, and corniculate cartilage, along with that epiglottis. So let's first look at the epiglottis. It's made of elastic cartilage. So it's strong, but it stretches. It'll cover that laryngeal inlet, so it covers that trachea when you swallow. So it prevents you from swallowing any kind of fluid or food into your lungs. That's what it's supposed to do. And even all the way down to that epiglottis, we still have taste buds. We have taste buds on that epiglottis as you're swallowing food down. So this kind of shows you have that hyoid bone in the neck. It's right about here. You can see that large Adam's apple in there. And below that is cricoid cartilage. And of course, you can see the sternum here with that jugular notch in the sternum. You see the clavicles. Here's a really nice outline of the manubrium right there, the top bone of the sternum. But here is what everything looks like from the inside. We have that epiglottis. It sits right behind that hyoid bone. Then we get to that thyroid cartilage. That large prominence right here is what you see in males that have that really defined Adam's apple. That cricoid cartilage is just below the thyroid cartilage. Then we have tracheal cartilages in rings going all the way down the trachea. We have ligaments that connect that hyoid bone to the thyroid cartilage, the thyroid cartilage to the cricoid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage to the tracheal cartilage. So there's stuff that connects everything to each other to help protect everything under there. So we have in the larynx our vocal folds or vocal ligaments. These vocal ligaments are called our true vocal cords. They attach to the arytenoid cartilages and to that thyroid cartilage. Your vocal cords have elastic fibers because those elastic fibers allow for good stretch and it recoils back to its normal shape. And we have what is called a glottis. That is the opening between the vocal folds. We have two, one on each side, and the glottis is when they open. You see this kind of slit like appearance when they open. And when you're trying to produce sound, these vocal folds actually vibrate. Because as we're breathing in and out air, as we're breathing in and out to talk, the air is running through those vocal folds and they're vibrating whenever you're trying to make any kind of sound. We also have what are called false vocal cords, or vestibular folds. These ones are above the vocal folds. They don't produce any sound, but they help to close that glottis during swallowing. We need that. So the epithelium of the larynx. Of course, we're going to get stratified squamous epithelium at the top. And then as we go below your vocal cords, it turns into that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That epithelium that secretes mucus helps to moisten air as it's breathing in all the way down, catching any foreign particles. It moves the mucus up towards the throat to be either coughed out or swallowed. This is a really good dissection of this. This is our hyoid bone, and And behind that hyoid bone, we're looking at it from behind. So you see this epiglottis. This is what closes when we swallow, so we don't inhale any food or liquids, which is called aspiration, actually. So you see that thyroid cartilage that's in the front that's helping to protect that epiglottis and that glottis. See our glottis here is that opening. Just below that opening is that cricoid cartilage. Just like it's just below the thyroid cartilage. You notice that in the front, you notice it, you can still see that it's below in the back. Then you start to see those tracheal rings. That tracheal cartilage helps to protect that trachea. Here's a drawing of it from the side. And you still see that hyoid bone. See the epiglottis. That's going to open and close. We have our thyroid cartilage, our cricoid cartilage. Here's our true vocal folds. You can see that really well here. This one is the true vocal folds. The one above it is the false vocal folds, or vestibular fold and vocal fold. And you see those tracheal cartilages as you go down. So here's where they send a scope down somebody's throat. You see that epiglottis at the top. You see the vestibular fold, or that false vocal cord. You see the vocal fold, which is that true vocal fold, and that whole opening is called the glottis. So how do we produce speech? Well, we produce speech by controlling the rate of air. Yes, false vocal cords are always above true vocal cords. So speech is, we're breathing out air, it's kind of controlled, and it's released in short bursts depending on what's going to be said, how long you need to hold something, a pitch for if you're singing or something, how loud you want to be. The louder your voice, the more air that needs to come through. And there's different things that can amplify or enhance the sound that's coming out. We have our oral, nasal, and sinus cavities. Those all kind of, they can enhance the sound, make it louder. They can amplify you and make you louder. We actually form our words through the pharynx, the tongue, the soft palate, and our lips. All the voice, the larynx, our voice box does is it vibrates to create a sound, and then our pharynx, tongue, soft palate, and lips are what work together to create what sound you're trying to make. So our larynx can have some sphincter type functions. because they can prevent air from moving in or moving out. There's a maneuver called the Valsalva maneuver. It's honestly what you use to empty your rectum if you're lifting heavy weights. What you're doing is you're preventing yourself from breathing out air. You're holding air in, you're kind of bearing down, and it can be used in a clinical setting to detect certain types of back pain. Because sometimes bearing down to empty your rectum can cause back pain. So that Valsalva maneuver is actually an orthopedic test that can be done to check for certain types of pains. So laryngitis. It's an itis, so it's an inflammation. The larynx is where our vocal cords are, our vocal folds. So that inflammation of the vocal folds is laryngitis. Your vocal folds swell. They get big. And then they're swelling, they can't vibrate. So they either change the tone of your voice or they prevent any kind of noise from coming out. Can cause you to get that hoarseness sound, or it could cause even a whisper. A lot of times it's viral infections that cause it, but if you tend to overuse your voice, that can cause you to get laryngitis. You talk all day, every day, or sing a lot, it could cause it. If you're in some place with very dry air, that can cause laryngitis. It's not just viral infections, some bacterial infections can do it. You can also have tumors that grow on your vocal cords. If you're in places where you may inhale some kind of irritating chemicals, that's another thing that it just irritates the vocal folds enough that it causes them to swell, and then they just don't work well. So as we're moving our way down, we've been through the nose, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, larynx. Now let's go to the trachea. The trachea is what's next. Our trachea is also known as our windpipe. That is what takes air down into our lungs, or takes it down to the two main bronchi that go to our lungs. We'll go into more detail about how that works here. So that trachea that comes down, it's going to split off into a right and a left. This is our trachea, so we've got lots of cartilage in here, those tracheal cartilages, all the way down. And then we get to bronchi next. But our trachea is about 4 inches long. It's maybe 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It has that hyaline cartilage to protect, but it also allows it to move. It's pretty flexible. And it's flexible for a good reason. So just like everything else that's composed of layers that we've talked about, the trachea is composed of layers. We have that mucosa, which is the layer that faces that opening in the trachea. Again, pseudostratified or ciliated pseudostratified epithelium with goblet cells. So those goblet cells are going to secrete mucus that those pseudostratified cells are going to help push that mucus back up towards the back of your throat. The next layer is connective tissue. We have seromucus glands in our submucosa, and that's where we also have our cartilage rings. So I said it kind of helps support that trachea. It helps prevent it from collapsing. We don't want our trachea to collapse because then we can't breathe. Then that outermost layer, we have an adventitia. That makes the outermost layer and it's connective tissue. So that trachea is smooth muscle and it's got those cartilaginous rings. That trachea can actually contract because that's how we get mucus out of our trachea, and that's what causes us to cough. That last tracheal ring, cartilaginous ring, that is found where that bronchi split off into that right or left. There's this cartilaginous ring here that's called the carina. It's very sensitive. So if something hits this very last cartilaginous ring, that's what can cause you to start coughing really hard to try to get out whatever hit that. Because all that should be coming past that is air. There shouldn't be any kind of fluids, food, anything getting down that far. If it does, that's where you start coughing like crazy. Like, so it almost starts to hurt trying to get it out. So here is our trachea. The trachea is in the front, just to kind of show direction of where it sits. The esophagus that we swallow our food in is behind the trachea. As you can see, our trachea is lined. You see these little finger-like projections in here, or little hairs, whichever you'd like to call them. These are that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That is our mucosa. We have a submucosa. That is just underneath that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. In that submucosa, we said we had those seromucus glands. We have that hyaline cartilage in there. Then on the very outside, we have that adventitia that is connective tissue. And those cartilaginous rings help to keep your trachea open this nicely so you can easily breathe air in and out. Not feel any kind of restriction when you're breathing. So here's the different layers to the esophagus. You see that top layer, this is the mucosa up through here. This is your pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Under that, we have our submucosa. You see the white areas in here? These are those seromucosa glands. Underneath that, we get to our hyaline cartilage. You see all these chondrocytes sitting in lacunae that they bury themselves in. Literally. They they build cartilage around themselves, so they kind of completely enclose themselves in that area. So, and they turn into chondrocytes now that they're in that area. So there's a lot of different layers to help protect our trachea. Here is a nice electron micrograph that shows that pseudostratified columnar epithelium. You see that cilia, the cilia beat in like a wave-like pattern to help move mucus away from the lungs. So what does smoking do? Smoking actually inhibits that cilia, and if continued smoking will actually destroy the cilia. So that cilia can't remove mucus away from the lungs. The mucus being produced by those goblet cells and that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, that mucus from those goblet cells are being secreted out, but instead of being pushed back up to the throat, it eventually starts to collect down in the lungs. That's part of what creates that smoker's cough, because they've got that cilia, or they've got that mucus in their lungs now because they don't have functioning cilia to get rid of it. But within a few weeks of you stop smoking, that cilia function comes back. They'll be able to do their job again when they're not being, when smoke isn't being inhaled. Takes a few weeks, but a few weeks isn't too bad if you think about it. And that cough, that smoker's cough, goes away. That cilia starts working. It starts beating that mucus away from the lungs again. So while smoking destroys it, if you stop smoking, it'll actually start to, things will start to function again. So if you've ever seen somebody choke on something, something goes down and closes off the trachea. That is where the Heimlich maneuver is beneficial. It's where you put pressure up into, it's just below the sternum where you do it because you're pushing up to try to push out whatever is obstructing their trachea that they may have swallowed because they are choking. Again, yes, it is best learned by demonstration because it can lead to cracked ribs if you don't do it correctly. One of my sister's bridesmaids, my brother had to do the Heimlich maneuver at her wedding for it because she drank too much and choked on her dinner. But it's something you don't ever really want to see. But being in the medical field, it's something you're going to have to know how to do. Even if you're not in like emergency type settings, you never know where you're going to use it. So, what comes next? We talked about the trachea, and we had mentioned how the trachea branches off to right and left. Those are bronchi. And in the bronchi, these air passageways will break off into 23 orders of branching. So they get this tree that comes out. The lungs are technically like a tree of branches. So we have conducting zone structures that will give rise to respiratory zone structures. So conducting is where the air moves through, while respiratory is where gas exchange happens. So that conducting zone, that is where the trachea divides into the left and right main or primary bronchi. It's a picture that I keep drawing over and over again, that trachea that branches off into that right and left main or primary bronchi. The right main bronchi is wider, shorter, and more vertical than the left. If you think about the cardiovascular system, it explains why. Because on the left side, we have the heart. The right side, we don't have as much of the heart sitting there, or we really shouldn't have much of any of it. So each main bronchus here will enter the hilum of one lung. So then we get our lungs over here. Our lungs have different lobes. The left lung, because of the heart, has 2 lobes, horribly drawn. The right lung has 3 lobes. And those right and left main primary bronchi will branch into lobar bronchi or secondary bronchi. Those secondary bronchi branch off one to each lobe. Then each of those lobar bronchi or secondary bronchi will branch into segmental or tertiary bronchi. Those segmental bronchi continue to divide and divide and divide. It's a total of 23 different branches that comes off. And as they come off, the branches get smaller and smaller and smaller. We eventually get into bronchioles. Those are very small. They're less than 1 millimeter. While terminal bronchioles, terminal means at the end, they're less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter. Terminal bronchioles lead to what are called those alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. So here's a much better drawing of the lungs. With the trachea, you see that carina cartilage right here. This is what causes you to cough very violently if anything were to hit it. But that is where our trachea divides into our left and right main or primary bronchus, bronchi for plural, bronchus for singular. From there, we will split into our lobar or secondary bronchus, one for each lobe of the lung. And then they split into their segmental or tertiary bronchus. So you can also see that left lung has a superior lobe and an inferior lobe, while the right lung has a superior lobe, middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. They don't actually, gas exchange doesn't happen in the bronchioles. Bronchioles lead to what we're going to talk about, what we're going to get to. We haven't even gotten to where gas exchange actually occurs yet. We're just following the air as it continues to travel down to where gas exchange occurs. Because gas exchange occurs in what are called alveoli. So we'll kind of get there as we keep going through our different conducting zones, because we're still looking at where air is transported to where it can be finally exchanged. So as we're going down, we go bronchi to bronchioles. What happens is we no longer have those cartilaginous rings. We have plates. Those bronchioles end up having elastic fibers that replaces all that cartilage. We go from pseudostratified to cuboidal. It's not as ciliated and there's not as many goblet cells. We get more smooth muscle in there. Those respiratory zones. Now let's look at where gas is actually exchanged. So as we keep going down, we get to those terminal bronchioles. Those terminal bronchioles feed into respiratory bronchioles. Those respiratory bronchioles go into alveolar ducts, which will finally feed into alveolar sacs. So if you think about it, you have your primary, your secondary, your tertiary. As you keep going down, tertiary, and then we keep going. You get your terminal, which feed into respiratory bronchioles, which lead into alveolar ducts, which are finally going to go into those alveolar sacs. So it's a long process to get air all the way down to where we can actually do our gas exchange. And those alveolar sacs contain what are called alveoli. We have about 3 million alveoli in our lungs. And that alveoli is where gas exchange occurs, because that is where we get all the way down to simple squamous epithelium. And that is the easiest epithelium for gases and everything to exchange back and forth. So these whole things here are alveoli or alveolar sacs. These are at the very end, and they contain all these little alveoli. These little alveoli is where gas exchange is going to happen, because we have those little flat, simple squamous epithelium in here. It wraps all the way around each one of those alveoli. And that alveoli, because of the simple squamous, it makes it very easy for, again, those gases to kind of exchange back and forth. I know if you took Anatomy 1 at Wabanzi, I know not everybody did, but most people did. One of the pictures that you guys actually looked at during chapter 4 tissues, when you looked at simple squamous epithelium, is you looked at alveolar, or those different alveoli. I know because I used the picture for my Anatomy 1 class over the summer and again this fall for showing the simple squamous epithelium. And this is the picture you saw. These are all the different alveoli. These are all simple squamous epithelium. And these areas through here are all the ducts that connect all these different alveoli together. So as gas gets exchanged in these alveoli, We're getting rid of that carbon dioxide and we're getting oxygen into our lungs at this point. So what all lives in that respiratory membrane? We have what is called a blood-air barrier that has alveolar and capillary walls. And capillaries are usually that single layer of simple squamous, a lot of times cells in those capillary walls. So that allows for exchange of nutrients and gases very easily in capillaries. But the alveoli are the same, the simple squamous epithelium, because it allows for easy passage of gases back and forth. And because the walls are so thin, everything occurs through simple diffusion. Means it just moves across that membrane without any use of ATP. So as I've said, it's a layer of squamous epithelium. They are considered type 1 alveolar cells. There are some cuboidal cells in there that are type 2 alveolar cells, but those secrete what are known as a surfactant. And they secrete antimicrobial proteins. These are things that try to help keep us from getting sick. Our alveoli are surrounded by elastic fibers, those pulmonary capillaries, because of course we have to get blood into the area so we can do gas exchange. We have pores. Those pores connect alveoli to each other, but they also equalize the air pressure. When we talk about the physiology of the lungs next week, and then we'll do some more of the lungs the following week, we'll kind of talk about why we need this equal pressure in there, because we don't need lungs to start collapsing. So we'll go into how all that works when we get to the physiology. But those alveolar pores, if there's a blockage somewhere that they can't get to some alveoli, it's going to provide other routes so air can go different directions. We have alveolar macrophages. Macrophages are our immune system. Those macrophages are going to help keep that area sterile. Here's an interesting fact. There's about 2 million dead macrophages per hour that cilia pumps back to your throat and you swallow every hour, about 2 million. So here is showing how this blood, these capillaries, they just surround every alveoli to help with gas exchange. We also have these elastic fibers. One next to it shows the elastic fibers that help those alveoli kind of keep their shape. You also see the smooth muscle in here, helping to move air, keeping air pressure stable. Here's an electron micrograph. You can only really see the capillaries well. You don't really see the alveoli, but you see just how numerous, how there's so many capillaries that are feeding to these alveoli to exchange out blood. So there's a lot going on in there. So here is another view. Usually capillaries are wide enough to let one blood cell through at a time. So you see all these these simple squamous epithelial cells, or the flat cells. They allow for easy diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the two. You also see these type 2 alveolar cells that they secrete surfactant. We have these alveolar pores, which are these holes that kind of go through. You see most of the type 1 alveolar cells, these are all those flat, simple squamous cells. But then you see all these capillaries. They're technically only supposed to be wide enough for one blood cell at a time. This picture makes them look a little bit bigger, but you can kind of see how everything and it all works together. So as we're breathing in and out air, it is causing gas exchanges. It is allowing your red blood cells to pick up oxygen and dispose of carbon dioxide. It's keeping the air clean because you see all these little purple things sticking around. Those are those macrophages that get pushed back up. Once they die, they get pushed back up and we swallow them down. So let's look at the lungs. Just a little bit more. So our lungs, they pretty much fill majority of that thoracic cavity and except for the mediastinum, because that is where our heart sits. The root of the lungs is where blood supply and those bronchial attachments happen at the mediastinum. Costal surfaces, costal are your ribs. So that's where your lungs kind of touch your ribs or attached to the ribs. We have an apex. We have a superior tip. It actually sits, it's not necessarily deep to your clavicles, it actually sits a little bit higher than your clavicles. You can see that apex at the top if you look at a chest x-ray. You can see them usually above the clavicles. And the base, that is the bottom that sits on the diaphragm. We have a hilum. The hilum of the lungs is where blood vessels enter and exit. That's where the bronchi are. We have a lot of nerves in that area. We also have a lot of lymphatic vessels in that area. So as we kind of looked at, we have a left lung specifically has that superior and inferior lobe. I kind of really badly draw it out here. So that superior and that inferior, but it's separated by this oblique fissure. We have cardiac notch. This is that cardiac notch in here. That is where our heart fits. Our right lung has a superior, middle, and an inferior lobe, as we looked at that one picture. Your right lung has a horizontal fissure and an oblique fissure. That horizontal fissure goes between the superior and middle lobes, and between the middle and the inferior lobes has an oblique fissure. So here is lungs. you see on this left side, you see that superior lobe with that oblique fissure that separates the superior lobe from the inferior lobe. The apex is all the way up at the top, and the base is at the bottom. It sits on the diaphragm. This right lobe, or right lung, we have a superior lobe with a horizontal fissure separating that superior from the middle lobe. Then we have an oblique fissure that separates that middle from the inferior lobe. I kind of put the heart back in here to see how that cardiac notch works. And then we have that diaphragm where the lungs sit on, and they help. It's one of the accessory muscles of breathing. It's one of the main muscles of breathing. Accessory muscles are other muscles. That was my bad. So here is an actual lung. This is a left lung. We are looking at it as if we were looking at it from the inside, because you can see you have this main bronchus over here, this left main bronchus. So this is right after we get where that split is in that trachea, where they split into right and left bronchi. So we're looking that way, in, or that medial view, as it says down here. Because then you can see that pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein that are coming in and out of the lungs. You see the superior lobe with that oblique fissure with the inferior lobe. The hilum of the lung, that is where all the blood supply and that main bronchus comes from. We have, from this angle, you see it as a cardiac impression, or this is labeled as cardiac impression, but that's where that cardiac notch is. There's also an aortic impression on that lung, because that aorta comes up and around and it follows that spinal cord down, but it also kind of has a place that sits in between, kind of in that left lung as well. Here's another view, a superior view. Again, you can see, you see the aorta over here. You see all these pulmonary arteries and veins on that left side, is where they're labeled. That's all at the root of the hilum, because that is all what you see going into that specific lung. That's what makes it that hilum, is what's going in. From this view, you also see how we have a visceral pleura, just like everything else, and a parietal cavity. Visceral means it's always going to line whatever organ it is. And then we have the parietal, which faces the outside, faces away from the organ. So as we've kind of talked about the steps down from the bronchi all the way down to getting to the alveoli, but each lobe can be divided in other ways too. Each lobe can also be divided into a bronchopulmonary segment. There's 10 on the right because there's more space on the right lung, and there's 8 to 10 on the left. Kind of depends. And it's going to be separated by some kind of connective tissue. They all have an artery and a vein and a bronchus. Those lobules, that is the smallest thing we can actually see. We can't see a lot of this stuff without a microscope, but a lobule is the smallest thing we can actually see. And it is a segment that is kind of served by bronchioles and their branches. We've talked about how those lungs have alveoli because that is where the gas exchange happens. And the rest of the area that is not alveoli is considered stroma. And that's elastic connective tissue. We'll look at the lungs in the cadavers. There's some, I know we looked at one when we were trying to find hearts. But those lungs, you can kind of feel them. They're kind of spongy. That's because of that elastic connective tissue. So here's a really nice electron micrograph of the lungs. We can see all the branches and divisions. This is showing us these bronchopulmonary segments and lobules. So you can see how there are 4 different segments or 4 different branches coming out into the superior lobe. This one has 5 branches coming out and off of that in the inferior lobe. This right lung has 3 different branches coming out in the superior lobe. Well, there's only 2 in that middle lobe, but there's 5 in that inferior lobe. So there are all those different branches that go out that feed out into those, eventually into those alveoli. So we know we have the pulmonary artery that takes deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs, and then those pulmonary veins that take the oxygenated blood back to the heart. Those pulmonary arteries, when they get to the lungs, they're going to kind of keep branching from arteries to smaller arteries to arterioles, which will eventually feed into capillaries. So we have that pulmonary capillary network that we looked at on slides before when we were talking about where gas exchange happens. And just like any other vein, or actually just pulmonary circulation in general, there's low pressure. It's so close to the heart, but it has a very high volume because all the blood that gets pumped back to the heart is going through the lungs before it goes back out to the body again. So it's got a lot of blood being pumped through it all day long. So our lung capillaries, they have enzymes. We have one that's called angiotensin converting enzyme because it helps to regulate blood pressure. Right, because it activates the blood pressure hormone, which regulates blood pressure. So there's hormones that kind of act everywhere in the body, as we've talked about. So bronchial circulation. Those bronchial arteries, we need something that's going to provide oxygen to the lung tissue. Just like the heart, even though the heart is always pumping blood, the heart needs arteries to feed the muscle, that cardiac muscle, nutrients. We need bronchial arteries to feed our lungs nutrition. Not just the gases being exchanged, but the actual lung tissue all needs some kind of blood supply to keep it healthy. As I said, it supplies all tissue except alveoli. Alveoli doesn't need bronchial arteries because that's where all the gas exchange is happening. So there's already exchange of nutrients and everything in that area. We have bronchial veins that'll anastomose with pulmonary veins. Anastomose means that they connect up with. So those bronchial veins kind of connect up with the pulmonary veins. And those pulmonary veins are going back to the heart with oxygenated blood. So how do our nerves get, or our lungs get innervation, get sensations? Lungs are technically innervated by parasympathetic and sympathetic motor nerves. They also have visceral sensory nerves, fibers. We have what is called a pulmonary plexus. So at the base, kind of our lungs, we have this plexus. Kind of comes out through here. Lots of nerves that all kind of connect together. They're kind of at that root where the lungs and the bronchus connect. And these plexuses run along these bronchial tubes. Just like with the heart, parasympathetic fibers, though, they cause bronchoconstriction. So it's different. Parasympathetic a lot of times causes things to relax, but in the lungs, they cause things to constrict. Sympathetic fibers cause bronchodilation. So our bronchi get bigger. They're sympathetic. So if you're really stressed, you're usually breathing a little bit heavier. It allows that your lungs to exchange air to get in there to exchange at a much faster rate. So that parasympathetic and those sympathetic fibers are helping to kind of monitor everything that is going on with the body here. So I've kind of showed in that picture, just like every other organ, we have a pleura, which is that double layered membrane, serous membrane. We have a parietal pleura. Again, that's what faces the wall, the outside away from the organ. And that visceral, that's what's on the lungs. Just like any other parietal layer or pleura, there's that thin cavity between that has pleural fluids. And it helps lubricate the area so everything, your lungs can move. It keeps the surface tension, and it allows your lungs to expand and recoil. So as you breathe in, it allows your lungs to expand out. When you breathe out, it allows your lungs to recoil back down. So here's that same picture where I pointed out that pleural cavity. This is filled with pleural fluid. The lungs have that pleural cavity, just like the heart has that pericardium or pericardial cavity. This is what kind of helps to keep everything, your lungs functioning smoothly. So if you've ever heard of pleurisy, it's where that pleura gets inflamed. Kind of happens with pneumonia. It kind of causes some friction in the area. You may get some kind of stabbing pain when every time you take a breath, or it could produce too much fluid, which can make it really hard to breathe. You don't have enough space for your lungs to expand correctly to breathe. But there's other things that can get into that pleural cavity. Blood. That's not good. Get blood in with that pleural fluid. We can also get blood filtrate. That blood filtrate is a fluid that comes from the lung capillaries during left-sided heart failure. Pleural effusion, anytime you see effusion of anything, it's a massive collection of fluid in that area. So pleural effusion, pleural is that cavity around the lungs. Effusion, there's fluid accumulation in that pleural cavity. So that is as far as I wanted to get tonight because I don't want to start respiratory physiology and make things really confusing right before you take your cardiology test, which opens at midnight tonight, and you will have until 11:59 on Monday night to finish. So you have 4 days to get it done. And that test is based off of the list that I gave out last week. I still have it. Here. Yes. So it's this list of how the autonomic nervous system monitors and regulates your heart rate, what causes the heart sounds, what's happening during the different phases of that cardiac cycle, what is a hemorrhage, what causes a hemorrhage, how does blood flow through the heart into the body, different layers of the heart, what are the different hormones that affect the heart, how is cardiac muscle different from skeletal muscle? Well, skeletal muscle doesn't have intercalated discs. Skeletal muscle doesn't have its own conducting system. What is preload? What are those pacemaker cells doing? How does potassium versus sodium work with that whole pacemaker system? Different types of arteries, atherosclerosis. What is our venous blood pressure? Pulse pressure. Our hypovolemic shock, what is that? How do we regulate our blood pressure? What causes peripheral resistance? Pulmonary circulation, primary and secondary hypertension. What's the difference? Secondary is usually caused by something else. Cerebral blood flow. Like we always have to have a consistent blood flow going to our brain, no matter what you're doing. If you're exercising really hard, even though there's a lot of blood going to your skeletal muscles, you're still sending the same amount of blood to your brain at all times. That's not asking, know all the blood vessels that go to the brain. No, that's too much. I'm not going to ask that kind of stuff. How do baroreceptors work? So all of that information in there, this is your cardiology exam that opens up at midnight tonight. If you have questions, you can let me know. Otherwise, that's all I have for you tonight. This is what we're going to be doing in lab. On Tuesday, we're going to be looking at lungs, like the And we're just gonna be looking at the anatomy of all of this stuff. Everything that we talked about tonight, we're gonna actually look at in the lab on Tuesday. So if you don't have any other questions, you are all free to go. It's an early night tonight.
I had a question.
Yes.
So I was wondering for the question about the different types of arteries, so is that more so like will we need to know like the written PowerPoint slides or IDing the images? Because there were a lot of images from slides 115 to 129, but before that it was all written.
It'll be written type information asking you to identify different kinds of blood vessels. That was on the practical.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And one more question I had was, um, let me see where I had it. Oh, yes. So, for the topic of what's happening during the different phases of the cardiac cycle, would that be like the isovolumetric relaxation phase versus what goes on in the isometric contraction phase, or is that like the atrial and ventricular diastole or systole? So, I just wasn't sure what phases meant.
Those are both different kinds of phases there, so it could mean both, or it could mean one or the other. That's telling you like exact questions on the test.
Okay.
Okay, well, everybody have a good night unless if there's any more questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you.
You're welcome.